Ladies and gentlemen, this is David Mirikitani with another episode of Weighing In, brought to you by USA Wrestling, the national governing body for wrestling in the United States, and by Nike Wrestling. Go to athleteps.com for all of your Nike and USA Wrestling branded gear. Here with the boys, Mark Ostrander and Grant Turner, and really excited to be joined from Flow. And Matt, I will let you give us your official title, Matt Bowlsby. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm Senior Director of Rights Acquisition, with one of my focuses being on wrestling. Our job is really to go out and find the right partnerships that we can invest in and help us, give us the opportunity to help grow the sport.
So I want to start by publicly thanking you for your support of Border Brawl and the stuff we're doing to try to raise money for veterans with amputations and PTSD. Flow's been a great partner in that, and just thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. And
for sure.
And I get to talk to Matt about some stuff, and he's a MBA and high-level thinker and business guy. And one of the things that we've put off talking about because of travel schedules and Fargo, and we will get to U17s, which were amazing, and we will probably talk a little bit of Stillwater news, but we want to focus today on conference realignment and what that means for wrestling. And so I'll kind of lay out what it is and then just let you guys talk about it. But I think the basic thing is that, the Big Ten added USC and UCLA. They're now actually the Big 16. The Big 12, which was the Big 10, is making moves. The SEC is adding schools. And basically what this all comes down to is people are chasing TV dollars. So Matt, maybe you could kind of start with that as somebody that sort of competes for some of these events in this space, and then kind of go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're right. The common thread between USC, UCLA, and the Big Ten is a monetary one. I think that COVID and some of the financial implications there probably sped up some of these conversations. And when you look at USC, UCLA, I'd say UCLA specifically, given they're probably $60 to $100 million in debt as an athletic department. It's survival of the fittest. So I think everyone out there is really trying to focus on what helps their institution move forward. And, I think there's a strong sense of not wanting to be the last person with the chair to sit on. And so when you look at USC and UCLA, there's certainly some sacrifice of tradition, puts the rest of the conference members in a tough spot. But if you're the AD at either school and you can double your media rights, that's a phone conversation you probably have to have. And if you're the Big Ten, the SEC, and you have those types of schools wanting to join you, you probably have to take those conversations, or they're going to find someone who will. And so I think if you're looking at the Big Ten, the SEC, it certainly stabilizes and puts them at the top of the pedestal. But for the rest, I think it really puts them in a tough spot potentially. When the contracts aren't concurrent, we have Pac-12 expiring, Big 12 expiring, ACC in about 2 decades expiring. It's not something you can just unwind easily. And then the great wild card in all this is Notre Dame, which has the potential to destabilize, but right now is what's keeping it stabilized. Not much is going to happen between now and football season, and not much is going to happen until Notre Dame decides whether they're going to get $75 million from NBC or whether they're going to go to a conference. All else being equal, they're going to stay independent because they really value the opportunities that provides for them. So it's an interesting time, and I think anyone who says that they know how this is going to end is lying, because having had conversations with my dad as the commissioner, with schools, with Pac-12 folks, everyone's exploring their options and trying to get educated on where this is all going. But there are a lot of decisions and conversations that need to happen before there's any clarity. And, I really wouldn't expect at this point that will happen in the near future, with the near future being the next 6 to 9 months.
So you said a lot, which is great. I think for those of us that maybe are just looking at this from a wrestling perspective, let's try to set the table and we'll have the other guys join in. the vast majority of this money, there's really comes from primarily two sports, football and men's basketball. And then a lot of this money comes from like the Big Ten network contracts, along with like bowl games and the NCAA basketball tournament. So like you mentioned specifically $75 million for Notre Dame to stay with NBC. Can you give us some specificity? For example, like what does UCLA and USC, what do they gain by going to the Big Ten?
Yeah, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think that Pac-12 overall distribution was probably around $40 million a year. That's going to go down probably a healthy amount with their next deal. I think with the Big Ten, we're yet to see what that deal will end up being, but it's within the realm of possibility that it'll be 80, 90, $100 million a year. And so for them to be able to double their money, stabilize their programs is really attractive.
And the reason why USC and UCLA are attractive isn't necessarily because they have the best teams. It has a lot to do with the markets they're in, the Los Angeles market. Is that
for sure?
Is that an accurate sentence?
I'd say that's, it's 70-30 in the favor of what you spoke of. USC, UCLA have great traditions, USC in football, UCLA in basketball, Olympic sports. I think it's unclear what they do with beach volleyball, water polo. They probably go to the MPSF. But yeah, it opens up those markets. I think a lot of people question the Big Ten when they added Maryland and Rutgers. No offense to those schools, but they didn't come in because they won national championships in football. They came in because you go from getting 12 cents a household in DC, New York, New Jersey, those areas, to now getting $1.30, $1.20, $1.30 a month. When you look at the number of households per month, it's real money. Adding those markets substantially drives up what you can charge because they're now in market versus out of market. And so that is a huge driver. And, it's not the sole driver, but it's a big driver when you look at expansion. And, you can't add a school unless the distribution per school goes up. And so it's important that, looking at the Pac-12, folks are saying San Diego State, Fresno State, the share per school is not going to go up. And so that's an important driver there of, when they add schools.
Well, and you told me something off the air, and I think it's okay to share. We were just having a conversation. You were saying like within the Pac-12, UCLA and USC brought more to the table economically than whatever other school, and there's no reason to, but that they were getting an equal share of the pie. So by them going over, they get maybe an equal share of a pie, but the pie is much bigger. So that's reasoning for going. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah. I think, UCLA and USC from their last TV deal to now have always felt like they've brought a larger share than they're getting distributed. But that's also going to be the case in the Big Ten. The average is lower than what the top teams bring in, but it will be a much higher number on average.
Gotcha. So, GT, let me preface this by saying I'm asking you your opinion on this as Grant Turner, not as Nike. But Nike's obviously a huge player at these universities. They have contracts with the entire school for every team, every sport. What can you feel comfortable talking about? Like, how did Nike look at this in terms of these schools jumping around at conferences?
Well, I think the people that do the collegiate deal, like all school deals, look at each institution and kind of do their own branding and money guidelines to a USC or UCLA based off of, once again, their historical background, the coaches that they have in place, how relevant they are within their, whatever their conference is. And I think as far as those guys making sure that those deals continue to be executed, yes, to Matt's point, the Olympic sport categories with UCLA and USC are amazing. They carry a lot of different sport categories in, Olympic hopefuls in a lot of those areas that Nike has vested interest. So as far as a Nike perspective on the schools, I think Nike's going to stand behind those institutions regardless of where they fall in the conference realignment process. But I think also with them, let's say going to a Big Ten or a conference where they're going to get more of that money allocated to them. Also, now USC is going to have 4 time zones worth of new fans coming to the Big Ten. And you're going to have USC people coming to town to, State College or Ann Arbor or Columbus. Like, you're going to have more people watching USC athletics or UCLA athletics in the Central and Eastern time zones now, because they're going to be coming to town all the time.
Well,
and
even vice versa. If you're Michigan, Ohio State, you're now playing games in LA where you can go out recruiting on Friday. You can be back at your hotel and ready for Saturday. So there's a lot of advantages both ways to having those types of markets.
Yeah, that's this stuff. A lot of these things are so layered. So, Mark, I want you to be able to jump in here. Maybe from the guy that's probably seen the most of us in life, like I'm old enough to remember that like Michigan versus USC was like almost always the Rose Bowl. It was Big Ten, Pac-10, and then all this stuff GT, don't nod like you that old. You don't.
Listen, just because I didn't watch it in color doesn't mean that ESPN has.
Just because you watch it on ESPN Classic doesn't mean.
Right, exactly. Like reel to reel, man. I know that's what you guys are doing.
So, Mark is a person that's seen a lot of this stuff and, obviously a fan of other sports. What do you think about this overall? And then I'm going to start talking to each of you guys about how the trickle down affects wrestling and other non-rep sports.
I don't do the money side of it, David. You kind of know that about me. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not big into, I just go day to day. I enjoy my life. I don't have to be a multimillionaire. I just like what I do and I give it everything I have. Matt, you talked about, things about how much more money they're in debt, and I understand that. They need to get out of debt. But loyalty to me is a big thing. And when they leave a conference that they've been in forever, and they were the elite, UCLA basketball was the elite. I mean, John Wooden is one of 3 or 4 coaches in the world or in the United States that we really follow that was the best at what he did, and I think Dan Gable in Iowa wrestling was one of those people. He was the best at what he did, winning the conference so many times in a row, winning so many Big Ten titles in a row, things like that. You hate to see that go. And I think money runs everything in this country, and I wish it wasn't that way because it's all about the dollar. It's not about the loyalty. It's not about what's best for the kids. Are we going to be able to get little Sammy here from a smaller town? Is he going to be able to go have a shot at being an All-American? Maybe not, because he's not one of the top 2 kids in the country, and there's 2 conferences now recruiting him. And if he's not the best, they're all going after the best guy. So it's just things like that kind of bothers me. And I don't know where it's going to play out. I'm hearing rumor in Iowa that the Big Ten is looking at North Carolina to bring them into their conference because they want them for basketball, not for football, not for wrestling. They want them for basketball because their numbers will go through the roof with North Carolina in the Big Ten. I don't know if that's ever going to happen, but I just hear that there's rumors of them. North Carolina wants to go to the Big Ten, or the Big Ten wants North Carolina. I'm not sure. Everybody wants Notre Dame. I don't think there's not a conference out there that doesn't want Notre Dame. But the loyalty thing has kind of been thrown aside, and I hate to see that happen. Matt, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think it's spot on. With my dad being an athletic director at several institutions and a Big 12 conference commissioner, I grew up hating Nebraska, Minnesota, Wisconsin, anyone around us.
That's freaking awesome.
I'd go 2 hours out of my way just not to drive through those towns. And those things are missed. I think people are quick to forget, though. I think some of the rivalries, even in the Big 12, compared to the Southwest Athletic Conference, are different. But years go by and new rivalries start. But I think it's spot on. I mean, it's money driven. It's college sports compared to 20 years ago is big business. I'm bearish on the idea of UNC or some of those schools going to the Big Ten or the SEC. ACC wanted stability, and they have their grant of rights through 2036. And so unlike UCLA, USC, UT, Oklahoma, where they can pay an exit fee in UT and Oklahoma's case and then buy out their media rights, a Clemson, North Carolina would have to buy out 15 years of media rights. That is, probably looking in the billions of dollars. And so it's a much harder conversation there. I think that, if Clemson and North Carolina could get out, they probably would have done so, based on the football option. And I think that right now ESPN has a pretty sweetheart deal there, with the ACC, where, Big Ten's going to renegotiate their contract probably 2 more times before, if not more, before ACC has another chance. And so there's going to be quite a distance between those conferences. And so, there are 2 challenges to the UNC, Clemson, whoever it might be. One is the grant of rights, and the sheer cost of making that move is astronomical. ESPN holds a lot of the cards. They could say, hey, we'll give up this sweetheart deal because it boosts us in XYZ way. But I think that's a tough mathematical equation. And people say, well, maybe they'll dissolve the ACC. If you're in the bottom 2/3 of that conference, why would you say yes to that? Clemson's going to want to say yes. North Carolina might want to say yes.
Find a new home.
And the rest, maybe they land in, the Big 12 or another conference, but, you have to imagine that vote's not in their favor to dissolve what they have. And so, there are a number of hurdles there. And, Notre Dame's, like I said, is sort of the linchpin in this. But I think the Big Ten would love to have UNC. I think, SEC would love to have Clemson football. But there's some major hurdles there.
Yeah.
What has the Big Ten been able to do to make this happen, though, Matt? I mean, is the Big Ten network a big part of that? Or because I know ESPN carries Big Ten games. I know ABC, NBC. I know those channels carry Big Ten games, but the Big Ten network does a lot. And it makes, I think, the conference quite a bit of money. How come they're able to do that and other conferences aren't?
Well, I would say the Big Ten network's not necessarily able to do it. It is Fox Sports owning 60%. This is the first time in college athletics history that the media partner has led the media negotiations. The Fox Sports team is leading their extension talks on what their deal is going to be. That's never happened before. That is unheard of in this business. And that's really what's driving that. And on the other side, ESPN's able, they have a lot more cards in their corner that they can play. And so how Big Ten can do this is, really having a media partner that can make the math work. Others don't have that flexibility. And so BTN's a part of it, but that's their 3rd tier rights. They're still the 1st and 2nd tier rights, which is what they're negotiating now. And, that's being led by Fox Sports.
So, Matt, you and I had a conversation, and this next part was why I wanted to, I don't need to say this to you. I think you're a really smart guy, but there was a very specific thing that you kind of educated me on. I'm like, I think our audience needs to hear this. You were comparing like the SEC contract to the Big Ten contract and the network, SEC network, Big Ten network, and explained how I thought, okay, well, as these networks make more money, this helps the non-revenue sports, specifically wrestling, which is what we care about, or like people across the world that care about lacrosse or soccer or, any of a number of worthy sports. Just we love wrestling. And you explained how maybe it could hurt because of the number of sports that specific conferences carry. So can you kind of lay out that groundwork for us so we can be educated and then talk about it?
Yeah, I think Big Ten's the best example just because it's more recent. For the Big Ten schools, there are a lot of positives. There's going to be a bunch more money, and if they distribute proportionate to how they do now, wrestling's going to get more, volleyball is going to get more, baseball is going to get more. But there's also the reality that there's 60 more basketball games 15 for each men's program, 15 for each women's program that now need a linear place to distribute. And so those games are the same season as wrestling. And so there are going to be some chess moves there of, does wrestling now move more to digital? Does it take a more approach closer to what they do with MAC football? Are we wrestling on Wednesdays and Thursdays now? And so there are some unintended consequences there where for linear TV, you can only have one show at a time. And, the men's basketball games are going to be on linear TV. And so, there's some questions that will have to be answered around those types of pieces that, the programs will have more, but for wrestling as a whole, it creates some challenges. And I think outside the Big Ten, you look at, some of the West Coast schools, some of the, those types, if their budget shrink, there's going to be impact there as well. And so I think there's a lot to be figured out because, these changes are largely driven by football, men's basketball, and women's basketball. And so they'll need to deal with that new reality. I think most of it will be positive, but for the growth of wrestling, we collectively need to find a way forward where we can keep pushing how valuable this is, because I think we can all agree wrestling's a very popular sport. There's a great audience out there for it. There are a lot of groups that have a lot of different opinions, and I think we could benefit from coming together and figuring out what that path forward is, because these decisions are being made largely based on football and basketball.
Amen. You said something else in our conversation that I wanted to bring up. You said, and I want, if I'm misquoting you, correct me. I think what you said was, hey, if the Big Ten is trying to compete with SEC in the revenue sports, and the SEC is winning because they have less non-revenue sports, so they can spend more on these sports, that it could potentially encourage schools to just drop some non-revenue sports so they can continue to be super relevant in the revenue sports. Did I quote you correctly? And if I did or didn't, expound upon that.
Yeah. And I think, a key comparison is probably baseball. The amount of money that goes in the SEC baseball programs is wildly larger than other conferences because they have less sports in the SEC. The money is distributed to fewer sports. You look at Stanford, USC, UCLA, they have a lot more sports than the SEC does. And so the money needs to be spread out further. And so, I don't think necessarily that leads to eliminating sports in the Big Ten, but it is a reality that it's harder to keep pace in some of those sports because they're paying their baseball coaches a ton of money. I think if you look at the last College World Series, and I might be misremembering the numbers, but it was something like there were 6 SEC schools and 2 Big 12 schools that were about to be in the SEC that made up the College World Series. There's like 2 or 3 teams that aren't there. And so, they're pouring more into those programs and Olympic sports than a lot of the Big Ten schools are able to, just because they're supporting more sports.
Is it simple way just to oversimplify it? Like if each conference has, I'm going to make this really dumb, but like $1 million, and one conference has 10 sports, then each one's getting 100,000, and one of them has 15 sports, and each one of them's getting about 6,667. And that extra marginal stuff is what can allow, if I'm coaching with the $10,000 budget and Mark or Grant are coaching with the $7,000 budget, it's probably going to be easier for me to beat them. I realize the numbers are drastically off, but is that sort of numerically kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. And numerically that is a reality that's going to persist. I would counter a little bit with money doesn't buy everything. UT spends $250 million a year and hasn't won a football conference championship, a men's basketball conference championship, or a baseball conference championship in 6, 7, 8 years. So there's also something to be said that money doesn't solve all the problems, but it helps.
Where does this leave Flow? I'm just curious how Flo looks at this, as clearly you guys are a player in a lot of these non-revenue sports specifically.
Yeah, I think we invest in Olympic sports more than anyone else. We have very strong softball programming, track and field, wrestling, a lot of these sports. I think in the college landscape, there are some hurdles there. Big Ten has their own platform. ACC, SEC, Pac-12 are locked into contracts, and so we're a little bit limited. And so I think we're in a spot of, we're willing to invest in a big way, but we need help from the community to figure out what that is, how we can make that impact. And I think right now there's a lot of division on what people do or don't want to do. I think wrestlers as a whole are creatures of habit, and I think it's tough to change. Change is never easy. So I think we're in a spot of trying to find ways to raise all ships. But we also need some folks who are willing to compromise and work with us, knowing that it's what's best for the sport. Because even Big Ten wrestling, it's the top conference, but they're going to have, once UCLA and USC are there, they're going to have less linear duels. It is going to be the end result. And so how do we keep giving the sport exposure? And so that's a big focus for us. And what I do in my job is going out, meeting with coaches, really trying to have some honest conversations of how do we grow the sport? How do we make it sustainable? How do we showcase the value? We think wrestling is extremely undervalued from a traditional media standpoint. And I know there's coaches in the Big Ten, trying to quantify what that's worth. Which is going to get harder now that football and basketball carry even more of the weight. But I think we're actively looking at all options and all paths, because tomorrow is going to be harder than yesterday was, and so we need to figure out what that path is together. I think we're willing to, whether it's writing a big check or covering the sport in new ways, we're willing to do that. But we can't do it alone. There are certainly relationships that we have that need to improve, and we're going to have to get creative. And it's not going to be an obvious path forward.
Mark or GT, any other questions before Matt, before we change topics or subjects?
Well, I guess I thought watching the Penn State Iowa duel the last 3 or 4 years, when they've had it, their attendances went up dramatically. Their viewership, I guess is what you would call it, has went through the roof.
Yep.
And if Flo is able to get in there and do more wrestling meets, and the Big Ten allows that, is that one of the alternatives that you're talking about? That it'd be be able to see that on Flo, so people can still see these meets? That would be phenomenal. But how many hoops do you have to jump through to get that done?
A lot.
That's what I was kind of wondering.
Yeah, it's a lot. And, we used to partner with the Big Ten. We've had conversations since, given the financial amount for non-revenue sports, it's at times tough to get yourself on the agenda for some of the larger conversations. But I think it is items like that. And not to say we're a group that can solve all issues, but I do know, when you look at not just distributing, but how do you create an audience before, during, and after? I think we can make a big difference there. The Iowa Penn State duel is going to stay on linear TV. Those top duels are going to stay there. But I think they had 26 duels on linear last year and 60, I believe, on digital. When USC and UCLA join, it might be 13, 14 duels. And so, it's yet to be seen what sort of impact that has.
GT?
Yeah, I think, this would be more in kind of the weeds in court, in Mark's conversation of viewership, is how well does wrestling do comparative to other Olympic sport categories through the Big Ten network? And does that help wrestling's cause in the linear TV programming to say, maybe 13 to 25 duels on a Friday, Saturday, you know, hitting maybe some high notes or something like that for wrestling. I mean, once again, that's a whole world that I don't know enough about to know that viewership for Penn State, Iowa is always going to be really good. But are we only just watching that duel every year? Or are we just, you know, does all of a sudden Minnesota has a really, really good squad one year and all of a sudden knock off Wisconsin, but nobody sees it? When they normally they would have maybe seen it on a BTN Friday night programming that we would have normally seen.
Yeah, and you know, I think at this point, you know, football, men's basketball, women's basketball is easy to quantify through Nielsen. Wrestling's a little harder to place a value on it, and so I think BTN's approach is that we don't know what it's worth. It is one of the top six sports. You know, it'd be football, men's basketball, women's volleyball, baseball, and softball, and wrestling. And so it's certainly one of the more valuable sports. But you know, if people are only tuning in for one duel or two duels, you know, regardless of the sport, regardless of the opportunity, it's tough to grow that. You know, if you know, I always say, you know, swimming and track and field are the biggest thing on the planet every 4 years. But how do you keep that audience and grow that audience moving forward? And you know, if it's the same 100 people watching wrestling, you know, the sport's not going to grow. And so that's where I think Flow can make a difference. Where you know, I think we do a pretty great job of growing an audience, engaging an audience, because we are investing in marketing and content, paid media. You know, some of these things that you know aren't a major part of the strategy for the linear groups. You know, even you know, ESPN for Duke, North Carolina basketball has pulled back the marketing spends that they assign to those events. And so when you keep going down, the efforts get more and more watered down. And so that's, you know, what, as I mentioned, areas we're going to need to figure out solutions, because if, you know, with inertia, if we keep going in the same direction, I don't think the results are what we want. And, you know, I think there's a massive audience. You know, NCAA wrestling gets 400,000 viewers a session, but, you know, if you only have that once a year, the sport's not going to grow. It's, you know, we need to turn mountains into mountain ranges. And we always look at the NFL, you know, once the season's over, it's draft talk, then it's free agency talk, then it's preseason camp, then it's the season starts. By the time you get to the Super Bowl, you know who you care about and why you care about them. And they've done an incredible job of building a monster entity where there's conversation on the NFL every single day. And that's, you know, obviously on a smaller scale from the NFL, but that's how you grow a sport. And so that's where we collectively need to work together to see what that looks like. Because if it's, go ahead.
Yeah, I think what Flow has really done, Matt, is you've brought the youth wrestling, whether it's high school, Fargo, freestyle, Greco, U17, U16s. You brought all this out to the forefront for, you know, college wrestling, basically, because that's where these kids are going to end up. And the fans are really enjoying watching it. And so it goes on all summer. Then it starts the wrestling season. Then you can now enter the portal. So there's talk like our podcast, like David had said many times, we don't know what we're going to talk about during the summer sometimes. And now we have 25 things every week we could talk about because there's just so much going on. So we're trying to stay out there and we're trying to stay relevant. And, you know, and Flow has a big part of that. You know, I watch Flow probably almost every day. And I go back and watch, you know, reruns of things just to stay up on what's going on. You guys do so well on the international stage. Does this being saved by the Olympic Sports Committee, I think it was, 8 years ago, Grant, where they were thinking about getting rid of it and then they kind of brought it back and cut the weights and stuff. Does that help the sport of wrestling that they've kept it? Or would we even be here if they hadn't kept it as an Olympic sport?
Yeah, I think it's no doubt a positive. You know, for most athletes, when you start out, the vision's winning an Olympic gold medal and representing your country. And so I think there's a massive amount of value there. And I appreciate the kind words on what we're doing. And there are a lot of other groups, you know, out there, you know, even our competition, you know, Rockfin has some content creators on there that are doing great work. You know, those things didn't exist 5, 7, 10 years ago. I think 10 years ago, there was a once a month print publication, and by the time you got it, it was out of date. And so, we're making strides. There's more people in the community, and the more people investing in the community, the more growth there is. And so I think we're hopefully a positive impact on that growth, but the division within the community slows that down. And so, we've shot ourselves in the foot several times, but I think there's also a lot of things that we're doing that are really positive. And so, I think there's some opportunity out there. And I think things like the Olympic movement, NCAA championships, they're the top of the sport, but for growth to come, we also need to find ways to move left on that bell curve towards the more casual fans. How do we turn casual fans into passionate fans and super fans? And I think that's where, the future of wrestling growth is going to come is, how do we make sure that people, the one thing if they only watch the NCAA tournament each year, the sport is going to be tough to grow the sport. So we need to find ways to create more exciting moments.
Yeah, it's really well said, because I don't watch hockey, but I'll watch the Stanley Cup Finals, or I'll watch a Game 7 of almost anything. I don't watch horse racing, but I'll watch the Kentucky Derby. I don't watch swimming, but I'm like everybody else. I'm watching it at the Olympics and somehow become a flip turn expert once every 4 years, stuff like that. And wrestling, all those sports and wrestling have that same issue. So that's probably 2 or 3 podcasts worth of literally how to grow that. There's, and
I don't think we can underestimate the impact of women's wrestling. I think having more representation in the sport, more state sanctioning wrestling, we're creating tomorrow's viewers, tomorrow's wrestlers. And, I think that's a really positive step in the last couple of years. Mike Moyer at NWCA has done a great job of getting women's college programs. I was obviously, it's an amazing step to have a school with that much wrestling history at a program. And so there are a lot of positives towards growth where, I think growing women's wrestling is good for everybody. Provides opportunity for young women, but it also brings more people into the sport, more people caring about the sport. And there are a lot of positives to take from that.
Now, when your dad was the commissioner of the Big Ten, and I'm sure you remember those days because you didn't want to go to Nebraska and through Oklahoma and things like that. But do you foresee UCLA, USC adding men and women's wrestling in the future?
I don't. And I don't base that on any inside knowledge. I think everyone says, hey, it's easy to add a sport, add these things. There are complications with Title IX. If you add a men's sport, you have to add a women's sport. And you also have 20 or so sports that all feel like they're under-resourced. So it's tough to go to your current head coaches and say, you don't have enough money, but it's going to go lower because we have to give money over here. And so I don't think it's impossible, but I don't think it's going to be a requirement of them to be in the Big Ten. And it probably won't be a priority in the near future, to be realistic. But obviously, it'd be great to get more representation on the West Coast. There's a lot of great wrestling out there.
Oh, there is. And especially in women's wrestling, California is really good with the young girls. And it's coming up, and that sport is growing probably as fast as any sport has ever grown. So if you're going to have to add 2 sports, out on the West Coast, you think men and women's wrestling might be a perfect fit right now.
Yeah. And, I think the folks that I've talked to, the idea of adding a wrestling program, they sort of need to endow it. And I think the number is probably close to $30 million to be able to get that up, scholarships, operational expenses. And so it's not a small number. It helps when you have $100 million in media revenue, that changes what you can do, but it's undecided how much of that goes to, improvements to the football facility, basketball facility, other facilities, and what's left over after all of those improvements. Obviously I'm in big support of adding wrestling. I'd love to see D1 wrestling in Texas as an example. There's a lot of talent here, and you have to go out of state in order to wrestle men's Division I wrestling. And so I think there are a lot of states ripe for a program. But we also look at some of the impact of COVID. A lot of people lost money, need to get back whole. So the idea of, hey, let's bring on more expenses is tough. UCLA, it might take them a while to get out of debt. So to add more programs, I think would be challenging. But 10 years from now, who knows? No one would have thought Arizona State would have a hockey program, but they do. So I think there's opportunities there, but maybe not in the short term.
Yeah, I think sometimes people make decisions or groups or organizations, and you look later, and if now you have all the information, it usually is financially driven, especially when it's a business decision, and some of us just don't always have all that information up front. I also had somebody really smart say to me, look, even if you add wrestling's programs and you take all the costs of the program, the coaches, the recruiting budget, the travel, everything, and if somehow they sold enough tickets to break even, now you have to have a compliance officer do more. And even if it's just break even net, it's probably not worth it just because of liability. Like you look what's going on in Stillwater right now, like that's a liability. And it's like, okay, well, if it's net even, and there's probably just as good a chance there's bad publicity, and we've already baked the good publicity into the revenue, and it's like, if grants or compliance officer hand him 2 more sports, that's not fun. It either makes him have to work harder, do less of a good of a job, or have to pay him more money. So there's so many layers to the economics of all this stuff that even if we think we're smart, there's usually something we're missing.
Yeah. And, I don't know that much about UCLA and USC's presidents, but I mean, the types of decisions that are made, going to the Big Ten obviously didn't make it to the Board of Regents in California, given Gavin Newsom jumping in. But, each president has a different philosophy of how the program should be run, what they want from their athletic department. And, having alignment between the athletic department and the president's office is a really important one. And so it is a case-by-case basis on how they make those decisions. And, I think it's, on us collectively to make the case that wrestling should be at the top of the list.
Absolutely. Matt, can you stick with us for about 5 minutes while we just hit a couple topics real quick?
Sure.
Okay, so news out of Stillwater. Today, the Stillwater Police Department filed a charge of sexual battery against AJ Ferrari, $25,000 bond. Charge comes almost a month to the day after the emergency protective order was granted to a Stillwater woman, reported an incident to the police department. Ferrari's lawyer, Derek Chance, released the following statement, quote, Ferrari family is disappointed by the state's decision to file this charge. We remain confident that through the legal process, AJ Jr. will be exonerated as he is innocent and the facts will no doubt prove it. So folks like Flo, Matt Rockfin, everybody's reporting on this. You guys can read up on that. GT, U17's epic performance by the United States. Everybody's looking good in their Nike gear. Everybody's watching it on Flow. So we got everybody tied in. Maybe just try to give people the 50,000-foot view on how well it went.
I don't necessarily have maybe some of the statistical data like right at my fingertips, but I mean, I can't remember a age group category doing this well in like all 3 styles. Like it would have to go back, maybe, I don't know. I think there was some stuff I saw on Twitter, like back into like maybe the late 90s of this age group winning this many medals potentially. But I mean, to put it in perspective, we are as a country performing at a very elite level in all 3 styles. And it was, I mean, every day there was new media posts coming out about medal bonus or like medal place winnings, people in the semifinals, just amazing acrobatic last second takedowns, like just with the coverage that Castillo hitting a flying squirrel on the Iranian, I think it was like Seeley's inside trip that he hit twice, I mean, there's just all sorts of moments just like that, not to cheapen anything else from anybody else's amazing runs at Worlds, but big shout out to my boy James Green, he's on the job less than 3 months and then has a historic performance. I don't want to say it's the James Green effect, but it's all James. So got to give him some credit.
It's not the James Green effect. Yeah.
No, I'm just saying that he wasn't there previously. Now he's there. He's bringing home a trophy on the plane. So
I have some numbers here real quick. 5 gold medals, 14 overall medals. Sorry. USA's outscored their opponents 562 to 326 in match points. In men's freestyle, 332 to 101. Women, 142 to 134. Greco, 91 to 86. It's unbelievable. And it ties to what Matt was saying about adding women's wrestling and the superstars of today become the superstars of tomorrow. It's another way to grow the sport. I want to give a personal congrats to Luke Lillidow, who's from St. Louis. He's now at SEM, was a runner-up a year ago, won this year, and did one of the coolest things I've ever seen when they gave him the flag to run around, gave the other end of the flag to his coach, Cornell Robinson, who was also one of the head coaches of the team, and had him do the lap with him. Cornell actually wrestled for my dad and I at Merrimack, so very, very cool moment to see on the airwaves of FloWrestling, so thank you for that, Matt. But we'll get maybe a little more into the details of that next week. Matt, your father officially retired?
Yes. I was with him this weekend for his final days, and a smile could not be taken. What's that? We did less work and more celebrating, but big smile on his face. And obviously, he's been in college athletics 50 years. And, he was 80 at UNI, Iowa, Stanford, been at the Big 12. So wrestled in college. So, wrestling's been in his blood, my family's blood for a really long time. His contract went through 2025, and with the new media rights deal going on, some other, big topics that they need to work through, it just became clear that he wasn't going to be there to see them to their conclusion. And it makes a lot of sense for the next person to be a part of that, as they're going to have to live with those decisions they make, whether that's a media rights deal or other big decisions. And so, I think he'll have to learn and find some hobbies. He's certainly not someone who sits still well, despite what he might say. And so we're thinking about live streaming him on a 24-hour basis just to see what he gets into. The latest is he's
big brother in the Bowlsby household.
It'll be a boring show. It's more of a sleep assistance for anyone who watches. But I think he's happy to get out. He has 10 grandkids, with 7 of them being in the Texas area. And so, I think he's happy to get out. And as things get more complicated, it's a young man's game. And, he turned 70 this year. So I think it's a little bittersweet to leave, but also just the right time for a lot of different reasons.
Well, he's a legend in our sport. Please pass along our heartfelt congratulations from Mark, GT, and I. I'm going to contact USA Wrestling. I think we're going to start 2 new shows. One will be the James Green Effect, and one will be the Bob Bowlsby Insomnia Cure show. So we got to put up there. So
late night radio.
Matt, thank you for joining us today. It was absolutely awesome. Thanks for letting us pick your brain and letting the audience. This was sort of a Matt chat with a weighing in, like where we just get to talk to somebody who's really smart and sees a lot more of the angles than we do. And so just appreciate your intellectual generosity.
Oh yeah. Always happy to chat. I appreciate you all having me on, and look forward to future shows.
All right.
Keep up the good work at Flow.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It really has been. So, and back in the day when we were working for Track, we couldn't say that. So now that we can, keep up the good work. That's a true statement, David.
I know it is.
For some of the track wrestling employees that came over, I think every one of them is still employed. But that first time putting on a Flow shirt, it felt like Johnny Damon going from the Red Sox to the Yankees a little bit. We're like, this just feels off. But they've been, you know, a tremendous addition to the team. They have a lot of really, really solid people who are respected. And, you know, I think they were strong in some things where we were weak and vice versa. And so it's been a pretty good marriage. And, you know, I think it'll be a good thing for the sport as, you know, with the two entities combined, I think we can go further. So it'll be an exciting couple of years.
Awesome.
Now, me with the guy that doesn't have a lot of hair, is there any chance Bader could get a haircut? I mean, any chance whatsoever?
I think the odds are slim. I wouldn't buy lottery tickets with those odds, let's say.
All right.
All right. It's been a great show. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening. We'll see you all next week.